All right, good afternoon. Welcome to Senate Education. It is Friday, I believe the 15th at 1:30, no, the 16th. Am I getting closer? I see
14th.
the 14th.
14th.
Okay, I won't go the other direction. Kicking off a great Senate Education meeting. Thanks for being with us. It is the 14th of January, 1:33 in the afternoon. We are going to shift some of our work to now look at the weighting study. And this is going to be Senate Education's first day of delving into, really delving deeply into this report. We have at this point, although it may change a little bit, I know that there are some committee members who would like to have a greater role in some of the other pieces and be in negotiations, I'm sure, with the corner office on this. But right now, we have been assigned 3 pieces to look specifically at. The one that we're going to kick off with is English language learners. But before we even jump into that, we've asked one of the main architects. Thankfully, we have 2 other architects of the report on this committee, but one of the lead architects, Senator Hardy, to join us to give us that overview, that some of the insight. If those of you who haven't had an opportunity to watch some of the committee hearings or make your way through all the detail of the report, even if you have, it's always a great reminder. And so, Senator Hardy, thanks for being with us. Thanks for jumping in, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Senator Campion, and thank you to members of Senate Education for having me here today. It's good to see all of you, although it feels like I've seen many of you already today. You're lucky to have both Senator Perchlik and Senator Hooker on the committee, who spent months and months with me on the task force, going through all of this in detail. So they have a lot of knowledge about all of the topics. And we did spend a significant amount of time discussing English language learners and how to fund additional supports for that population of students. And that is one of the topics that has been assigned to your committee to start with, because it really is an educational program, and really wanting to make sure that we're sufficiently addressing the education needs of English language learners. I was going to walk you through some of the considerations and things that the task force thought about and really focused on in terms of our recommendation for ELL. And then I can also touch on the other topics that you're assigned briefly, if that's helpful. But on your website is a copy of the full task force report. And I would direct you to the section that's on English language learners. You can click on the thing at the beginning and get to it. But it starts on page 18. It's section 6. And this really walks through a lot of the process that we went through in the thought process and the points that we were thinking about for English language learners. One of the main things that the task force learned early about English language learners is that while there are about 1,800, give or take, in the state, so it's a small portion of our total student population of about 85,000-ish. And most of the 1,800 English language learners are concentrated in 5 school districts, or 10 if you want to take it out to the next level. And the 5 school districts with the most of them are in Chittenden County, the largest one being the Burlington School District with over 500 English language learner students. But there are a growing number of school districts that are educating English language learners as populations shift and move throughout the state, and as new people move into our state and settle in different communities. So there is a significant growth in the number of districts that are serving English language learners, and there is some growth in the number of English language learners themselves. So what we found is there are sort of three categories of districts, broadly speaking. There are the districts that have a significant number of ELL students to educate, most of those being in Chittenden County. There are districts that have a growing population of English language learners, and those tend to be on the outskirts of Chittenden County or in larger towns throughout the rest of the state, like Montpelier, Rutland, Brattleboro. And those districts are really trying to build programs for ELL students. And I see you have somebody from Milton coming in, and that's a good example of a district that's in that category. And then there are dozens of other districts that have 1, 2, 3, 4, just a few English language learning students that come and go depending on where they live. So we have these varying types of school district populations when it comes to English language learners, and therefore varying educational sort of needs on a programmatic level. On an individual student levels, individual students still need the same types of English language learning, and schools are required by federal law to provide those services, no matter if they have 500 kids or 5 kids. They are required by federal law to provide those services. Because of the uneven distribution of ELL students in our state, the other thing we learned early on in digging into the original pupil weighting factors report is that the weight for English language learners is more difficult to accurately calculate. It is inconsistent. And if you look at our report, our task force report, we quote pretty extensively from the original pupil weighting report about their difficulty with getting an accurate weight for ELL, because to put it very basically, I'm not a statistician, but to put it very basically, the math doesn't work as well. And the weight is not as statistically significant as, say, the weight for poverty or the weight for grade level. And in fact, in one of their sets of weights, the weight for English language learner was actually a negative weight. And if you apply a negative weight, you would actually be taking tax capacity away from a school district. So that was kind of a red flag for us, as we were like, hey, the weights don't work as well for ELL. And that's because of the concentration in a few school districts, and then the very small dispersion of numbers across a large number of school districts. The weights just didn't work as well. So that's when we started thinking about maybe a different funding mechanism for ELL would work better. And that led us to exploring the potential of a categorical aid grant. And if you look at the report that we wrote, there are a number of links to other testimony or other resources that might be helpful to you as well. I could send them to your committee if you want them individually posted on your website, but there are links to all of them in this report, including data on the numbers of ELL students and the number of in each individual district. So when we were thinking about a categorical aid program, we were trying to create one that would address the needs of students in school districts with a lot of ELL students, and then those districts with very few students. And the weights themselves, the way they work, is that they don't actually provide actual resources. It's not money that goes to a school district when you change the weights. It's a change in tax capacity. So the ability of a school district to raise taxes or lower taxes, raise their budget or lower their budget, and the impact of taxes in their budget. It doesn't actually send a check to school districts. On the flip side, a categorical aid does send a check to a school district. That is an aid amount that goes directly to a school district. And the categorical aid that is most well known is special education. So that's how special education is funded in most states, including in Vermont. It's also how we fund transportation. It is also how we fund small schools at this point, but that would be a change if we go with the recommendations of the People Waiting Task Force. So it's not an unknown thing to school districts in Vermont. Categorical aids are pretty common, and they're often used for targeting aid to a specific program or a specific type of student. And if you look in the report, I link to some testimonies specifically from Professor Colby, where she talks about when a categorical aid is the most commonly used and most effective funding mechanism. And I definitely encourage you to have Professor Colby in to talk about that and ELL. So when we were designing one, we tried to think of how can we meet the needs of varying school districts and came up with a base amount per school district. In the original proposal of the task force, it was a base amount of $25,000 for every school district that had even one kid who needed ELL services. And then a per pupil amount on top of that of $5,000. So the minimum any school district would get would be $30,000, which if they have one child who needs ELL services would be sufficient funding for them to hire a part-time ELL instructor to meet the instructional needs of that student. And then it would go up from there. So $5,000 on top of it. And then we built in an inflator for both the base amount and the per pupil amount. And the way that we came up with those numbers was to really look at what school districts are currently spending on ELL students, and then also what other states are providing as additional resources for ELL students. And what school districts are currently spending on ELL students varies pretty greatly across school districts, and it doesn't always match up with the way you would think about it. But the districts that have a lot of ELL students, Winooski and Burlington being the two with the most, they spend around $7,500 per student above and beyond what the base amount per student is. And then there are some districts that spend more than that. One district we saw spent $10,000 per student, and then some that are spending almost nothing extra or very little extra per student. So there was a big range, and that also was a red flag. Why is there such a big range for these school districts? So 5,000 was really in this range of kind of in the middle, per pupil additional. I want to stress that it's on a top of what the base amount for funding for students is. And then we looked at what other states are, and there's a link in the report to what other states are funding as additional amounts per pupil for ELL programs. And that ranged pretty significantly, I think from like $48 extra to $7,500 extra. So we didn't want to be at the $48. That seemed way too low, but $7,500 seemed more reasonable. And our 5,000 sort of fit within that range of a larger amount and was consistent with what we were seeing was spent in districts in Vermont. So that's sort of how we came up with the numbers in the original proposal by the task force. However, we also noted that this was, not an empirically derived number, but a number that we looked at based on the factors that I just talked about. So we asked Professor Colby if she and her team could rerun cost numbers for all of the weights. So all the weights are determined by first determining a cost factor that is behind each weight, that is the additional average cost per pupil to bring up certain groups of students to an average outcome. And the average outcome that they were looking at was exclusively math and English test scores. So they were saying, how much more do you need to spend for an average student in poverty, or an average student who goes to a small school, or an average high school student? And in this case, an average ELL student. So what we did was we asked them to actually calculate the cost factor behind each of the weighting factors. And we asked them this in November, and we did just 2 days, 3 days ago now, because it's the 14th, got a memo from them, which is on your website. And they provide cost factors for all of the weights, but the one that's specific to this conversation is ELL. And if you look at that on your website, the final page, page 9, has a table with all the cost factor amounts on it. And they did it based on 2018 data, which is the year that their report is based on, is 2018. And they inflated it to get to 2023 numbers, which are, this year we're budgeting for 2023. So depending on when we implemented it, we would have to inflate it for whatever year it is. So their number is $25,335 for an average additional amount per ELL student. And in this memo, which they sent following a conversation, actually, Catherine Benham and I had a conversation with Professor Colby and asked her a series of questions. And she and her team respond directly to those questions, and they're about ELL. So I really encourage you to look at that and have her in to talk to you about it. But some of the questions that we were asking were about what is sort of the marginal cost for an ELL student. If the average cost is $25,000, if you add an additional student, what's the marginal cost? How do you deal with economies of scale? There's a different economy of scale for a program that has 500 students versus a program that has 5 students. And they were not really able to answer those questions in a way that would lead us to a number. So I guess I would encourage you, as one of your next steps, is to really dig into that a little bit more with Professor Colby and see if you can figure that out, because the 25,335 is an average amount, and wanting to really kind of break it down to see if that's the right amount. I would ask more questions about that. And the number is obviously much, much higher than what we started with. And, she provides a lot of explanation as to why that is. And I think a lot of it is really, really helpful information. All of it's helpful information. But, you can certainly ask her more about why it's as high as it is. And I think that one of the reasons is that our schools across the country really have not provided sufficient resources for school districts that are trying to educate ELL students. So across the board, the states are not providing sufficient resources. Is this number the right number? I think even Professor Colby and her team say they're not entirely confident it's the right number, but it's empirically derived from the same methodology they use to derive the weights. And that's really important. So it is not just an educated guess, which is what we were working with before. This is an empirically derived number. The question is, as you know, even just because something's empirically derived doesn't mean it's the right number. And so I think, trying to really probe more into what is the right number. And then also the question of, should there be a base funding amount to start with, and then a per pupil amount on top of that, to get to the school districts with very few students. But one of the big benefits of having a categorical aid program for a program like this is one, the costs are very identifiable. School districts can tell you how much they're spending on ELL students. And some of them have more elaborate or more, robust programs than others. But there's ELL teachers, there's ELL curriculum, there's translators, there's student support, there's parent outreach and support. Those are things that are known costs. In some of the other categories like poverty, it's a lot more ambiguous. What is the school district spending to meet the needs of students in poverty? That is something that is very, very dependent on a school district and very dependent on an individual student's needs in a way that is more not quite as concrete as for ELL education. The other thing is that a categorical aid provides accountability to make sure that school districts are actually spending the money on the students' needs. A weight, as I said, just changes a school district's taxing capacity. There's no guarantee that the school district will actually budget for and raise the taxes necessary and raise the revenue necessary, and then spend that money on a student. A categorical aid program provides the accountability to know that the school district is spending that money on an individual student or program or educational need. And school districts that have any ELL students are already required to meet the requirements of the federal law for ELL. I believe it's Title III. So it's not an additional requirement, but it's an additional accountability mechanism to make sure that school districts are spending this money. And what we saw in the data that we were provided about school districts' expenditures is they might not all be doing that, because there's a very wide range in how much school districts are spending. So this would give a level of accountability, particularly for a group of students that is a protected class. ELL students are generally students of color or students who have language learning needs that makes them a protected class, meaning that we have to be incredibly sure that we are providing them with the educational resources necessary to meet their educational needs. And a categorical aid program would be much more likely to be able to provide that kind of assurances, regardless of where they go to school. That was another sort of reason we felt like a categorical aid program would be a better route for ELL students. So I'm sure I've forgotten something, but that is the basic spiel on ELL. And I'm happy to answer questions about any of that, or direct you to resources or whatever you need.
Committee, questions on ELL? Please, Senator Chinden.
So I'll just make a comment more than a question. I'm really appreciative of Professor Colby's report here, because I see all the rationale you laid out for looking at categorical aid for ELL, and I think that merits further discussion. My concern with the original numbers that were put forward, the educated guess, was that would effectively, in my back of the napkin calculations, have directed less monies to the schools that have a large population of ELL students, and that would be concerning to me, because they need more resources. And so I'm looking forward to diving into these numbers more and better understanding what that marginal cost would be, so that we can ensure that schools with these populations aren't penalized by a recalculation of funding for the students that need these services.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I will note, and I see that Senator Lyons has her hand up, but in the back of the pupil weighting factors report, task force report, are printouts for how each district is impacted. They will need to be rerun now that we have new numbers. So it's really important that we give JFO time to do that, and it will and as you make decisions in this committee, and as the finance committee makes decisions in that committee on different funding levels or mechanisms, it all needs to be remodeled, and that takes a little bit of time. It's AOE and JFO working together to do that. So I do want to caution you before you start throwing numbers out there to your constituents that we need to rerun all the numbers first.
Senator Lyons.
Thank you. And thank you, Senator Hardy. That was really clear and helpful. Just a couple questions in terms of doing the analysis on the needs-based analysis, and how the task force determined how much is needed either per student or when you reach a critical mass, and knowing that all ELL students are not equal, and that you've got maybe 70 different languages, but how was the needs assessment done? And then was there any analysis of outcomes based on what's currently happening in some of these schools where more or fewer ELL students exist?
Mm-hmm. So the report, the original pupil weighting factors report, is the report that did the analysis on additional resources needed to meet a common outcome for different types of students. So that's the report that did the analysis on outcomes and resources. The pupil weighting task force, we did not do that level of analysis. What we were trying to do was take the analysis that was done by Professor Colby and her team and make policy recommendations out of that. And because of their basically concern with the efficacy of the weight for ELL, that's when we started looking at other options for ELL. And it wasn't not the Professor Colby's report and her team, they did not do a resource-based analysis. That's a different type of analysis. And we actually had a resource-based analysis done for us schools in Vermont in 2016. And I'm sure that that's on the Pupil Weighting Task Force website, but I'm sure that Catherine Benham could give you that as well. It was a report commissioned, I believe, by the legislature or JFO. And actually that report, the overall conclusions was that Vermont provided sufficient resources. And the resources necessary for ELL in that report were much lower. They suggested a ratio of 100 students to 1 teacher for ELL. That was their sort of base recommendation. So there are different methodologies, and I would, I do think that looking at a different methodology as a sort of, getting a second opinion is always important, just like when you're doing a big medical procedure, you want a second opinion. But we didn't do that level of analysis. I think that you're talking about, Senator Lyons. We were just trying to look at existing data, including what our school districts are currently spending on ELL, what the pupil weighting factors report had, and then also what other states are doing. We got testimony from the Education Commission of the states, which has a 50-state comparison in a whole bunch of different areas, including English language learning. So that was the data that we were looking at.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And then of course, we'll be talking about this and consideration for the cultural needs of the students, social and cultural needs of the students, which goes a bit further. But then the other question is looking at volunteer services that are so critical in some of the larger programs. So, but thank you. This is very helpful, and we have a lot to go through. Appreciate your work.
Thanks.
Senator Perschlick.
You, Senator Hardy. On the last question from Senator Lyons is something I had thought to ask before during the task force, which is the cultural liaisons, which we met when you were on Senate Education, Senator Hardy, and that we had other testimony on. Do you know if those salaries are included in their ELL numbers, or is that something is one of those things that's related but separately accounted for in the budgets?
Right. So I think I'm just looking as you're asking this. When we were designing, as you know, the ELL grant sort of parameters in the task force, we included cultural liaisons as something that we, wanted to have funded by additional money, because it's certainly a important service that's provided to students. I'm looking just quickly. We got testimony from Winooski and Burlington about what their total budget for ELL students is. And I believe they included in that their cultural liaisons, but I guess that's a question you should ask the school districts. You should certainly have, I'm sure Burlington and Winooski are eager to come in and talk with you guys. They have very strong opinions, of course, about this. So I would ask them that as well. Another note just that reminded me, Senator Perchlik, you probably recall we got data from FY20 from AOE about what every school district in the state was spending on ELL. And it was fairly new data. The ELL is implementing their new financing system, which you probably heard about. And they are just starting to collect some of this granular data. So they may have, at this point, even more updated data that you could ask AOE for the FY21 data. I think the data we got was 20, maybe 19. But that would show what school districts are spending on ELL too.
Okay. And when you mentioned that we'll need to rerun spreadsheets in the back, is that from this January memo that Colby and her team did? So we would put in the different numbers for the equity payments, or are you talking specifically about the dollar amount for the ELL, or both?
It's both potentially. So when categorical aid programs are taken sort of off the top, as we all say in shorthand, of the education fund, they're spent first off the top of the education fund, and whatever is left over in funding is then distributed using the formula after things are taken off the top. And so as you create or reduce categorical aid, it changes the pool in the education fund that is distributed based on equalized pupils, and it changes the yield that is used to determine tax rates. So if we were to recommend creating a new categorical aid program for ELL students and potentially eliminating an existing categorical aid program for small schools, those two mechanisms would change the amount that's taken off the top, and therefore the bigger pool, and would change the yield. So it has a ripple effect in the system. So you would have to rerun it because the yield would change. So that's one thing. So if we change the numbers that are in the pupil weighting task force report right now, were run based on the 5,000, 25,000 categorical aid program. So if you were to increase the amount to 25,000 or whatever, that would change the yield and the amount. And then any decisions that are made in this committee or in finance or whatever about the weights or the cost equity payment option would also potentially change. And we also, as you remember, Senator Perchlik, ran it on FY20. We tried to do pre-pandemic numbers. So 20 was the last year that was budgets were not impacted by the pandemic. So we could rerun it, potentially moving it up to FY22 probably, and that would change too, but it would also be impacted by the pandemic. So those are all things that JFO could talk, and AOE. Brad James, he lives and breathes this stuff, so you can have him in too.
Okay, and the last question is on this point that Senator Chittenden brought up, and I think we also heard on the task force that those districts, looking at the dollar number that the task force had recommended as a starting point, and then what I think that they were saying, and what Senator Chittenden was pointing out, was like, if they just took what they're spending today and then took what their ELL categorical grant was, they saw the categorical grant as a dollar amount that was less, which is the way Senator Chittenden said, is like the state will be sending them less money. I mean, the state will send them all the money that they approve either way, because that's the way the education system works, right? It's a statewide funding. They'll approve a budget. We'll send them that money. So I wondered if you can kind of just to address how we should look at that, the difference between what they're spending before and what their ELL grant would be. Does that make sense as a question?
I think so.
Great question.
So currently school districts, there are 5, I think 6 maybe school districts that get a federal essentially categorical grant for ELL. And those are the districts that have the most number of students. The rest of the districts get no additional state or federal funds for ELL. And so all
Senator Hardy,
districts—
just to interrupt for a second, just even if they had a few students, they're not receiving anything at this point.
Nothing. They're receiving
Yeah.
no targeted aid that's specifically for
Or
ELL.
ELL? Okay.
Just those 5 districts that are getting the federal aid are.
There was a floor. You had to have a certain number. Before.
Certain numbers.
Correct.
Thank you.
And so every single district in the state is funding ELL currently out of their local budget.
Yeah.
And they're doing so based on local budgeting decisions. And they're determining how much money they want to spend on ELL or need to spend on ELL. And then they are, putting it into their full budget, and they are putting it before their voters and asking their voters to approve that local budget. So all ELL decisions in every single school district in the state is locally determined right now. There is not state aid that goes to districts. There is a current weight for ELL, and it's a little funky, I guess is the right word. There's a 0.2 weight for every ELL student. And then ELL students that are not in poverty are added to the poverty count for weighting and considered to be in poverty, even if they're not in poverty. And so it's added to the 0.25 weight. And those weights are calculated and used to determine equalized pupils. So equalized pupils are the weighted pupils that are then used to determine, you take your full education spending that your district wants to budget for, which is total spending, less federal aid and less categorical aid. And you take your your equalized pupils and you divide it into your total education funding, and you get your equalized funding per pupil. And then that's used to determine local tax rates. So districts have the ability to set their budgets at the local level based on what their tolerance for a tax rate is. And some districts, and we talked about this at length, Senator Perchlik, I know, and Senator Hooker, that, some districts have different tolerances for tax rates for, raising or lowering taxes. So the districts that, if we increase the categorical aid funding for ELL or created categorical aid funding, it's taken out of that calculation, and it's sort of the first thing off the top. But the weights don't give a district funding from the state. They give that district tax capacity that the district itself determines what to do with. And some districts use their full tax capacity and have larger budgets, and some districts don't because they just don't have the tax tolerance for it, or whatever the right word is. So they could potentially be spending more if they wanted to, and their voters would approve it. It's a tricky thing,
No,
but I don't.
That's really helpful. Yeah.
It's not an apples to apples comparison in the way that it's not the state saying this is how much money you're getting. It's local decisions based on the priorities, the needs, and the taxing tolerances in those districts. There are districts that have a large number of ELL students right now that could increase their budget for those students if they felt like they could, weather the taxing capacity.
Yeah. Senator Hardy, would you say, I mean, it seems to me that the shift to categorical, there are a lot of winners. Who are the losers, for lack of a better word? Who loses out if we make this shift in this way?
Well, I think it depends on the perspective of the school district. There were districts who felt like if we increased the weight, and that's what they were looking at, like the increase.
If they chose to increase the weight.
If we chose
right, and they
chose to increase the weight, and then they chose to increase their budget, so it's a double thing. Like we gave them higher weights for certain types of students, and then the school districts decided to take advantage of those higher weights and increase their budgets. Mm-hmm. So that's the key thing. The state does not set the budget; the local school district does. So it's a two-step thing. If they choose to use that extra taxing capacity to put it toward ELL students, I think that some districts were looking at, like, oh, we would use all of that taxing capacity, and that would give us more money than a categorical aid would. And the weights are also interactive so that they sometimes cancel each other out, and the higher weights cancel out the lower weights. And Brad James has a fascinating presentation on this one too. So it's not always as simple as saying we're going to, you can't just take the weight and calculate it in isolation, because the ELL weight interacts with the poverty weight, which interacts with the school level weight. And so it's not a straight calculation. And I think some districts were just taking that straight calculation and saying, we're going to get this much more money from the state and we could put it toward ELL, but that's really not how it works. So to answer your question about winners and losers, which I will say, we tried really hard not to use those terms, but
I understand.
I think that that what we were trying to do as a task force was to make all districts winners for ELL students, really more make all ELL students winners, and to provide adequate and sufficient aid. And we knew we didn't necessarily have the right number, and that's why we asked Tammy Colby for a better number. I don't think there's a perfect number out there. So that we could really ensure that no matter where a kid went to school, if they needed ELL services, they would be able to get them at a sufficiently funded. So that was really our goal.
Senator Hooker.
I just want to say thank you to Senator Hardy, who's worked so hard on this and understands it as well as anybody, certainly. And I hope that you'll take her suggestion that we hear from places like Winooski and Burlington, because they did have a different take on things, and it might help to clarify. Just a question, and maybe I'm being too simplistic, but is it fair to say that ELL will come off the top of the educational funding for the whole state, and so therefore we're all sharing in that cost? And is that a simplistic a way to look at it?
No, I mean, I said it to Senator Hooker. That's kind of the shorthand term for what we use. And I'm sure Catherine Benham has a more complex explanation, but it really, categorical aid grants are funded first out of the education fund. They are distributed and funded first. Special education, transportation aid, right now, small schools grants, all that is funded first, and then the yield is calculated and the per pupil amount for each school district is then calculated and sent out to districts. So you're right, categorical aid funds are shared by all districts in the state. We all share in funding them. And that was another thing that I think for a lot of members of the task force was really important, that we as a state have made a lot of public statements about how we want to welcome refugees and welcome new Vermonters and immigrants to our state. And many of those people may need ELL services, at least for a few years, if not for many years. And we wanted to show that we had a shared commitment and a collective commitment to funding those services for students, regardless of where they live. And that's what will happen with a categorical aid program, is that it's funded first off the top of the education fund, and it is shared by no matter what district you go to school in or wherever you live.
Senator Perschlick.
Thank you. Senator Hardy, I saw a comment, I think from one of the schools, or maybe it was from the coalition, that suggested that the ELL for these small districts, or the districts that only have under 5 students, that the categorical grant was beneficial. So I think that they suggested maybe doing an option. And so I wondered if you would respond to that idea. I think their idea was each district would decide whether they wanted to do the categorical grant or the weight.
I think you could ask Brad James that, and I can only imagine his response. That would be super complicated in terms of running the school aid formula, with districts deciding themselves which they think they're going to benefit from more. And it would also mess up the interaction between the weights. I think if you ask Professor Colby, how would you calculate a weight if like 5 districts are going to take the weight and 100 one districts are going to take the grant, it would really change the weight. And I think they would have to rerun it to make it a more empirical weight, the weight that they suggest would no longer be valid, because the weights are based on interactions between each other. So the poverty weight is in conjunction with the other weights. So you can't just have some of the districts have the weight and some of the other districts not have the weight. That being said, I think you could do some kind of hybrid program where maybe you have additional funding going to certain districts that need it for whatever reason. You have a weight, and then you have a categorical aid program on top of that weight. That might work as a sort of hybrid approach. And you certainly could ask both Professor Colby and Brad James and others about that potential as a hybrid approach. But I think having districts get to choose which they want would be kind of a mathematical nightmare, and it wouldn't work out well.
Okay, thanks.
Senator Hardy, when you started the conversation, you mentioned something, I may be not quoting you correctly, but you said primarily we're looking at 5 districts that really have most of Vermont's ELL students. And then you said something like, or we could refer to it as 10. Is that because there are sort of emerging districts? In other words, for example, in Bennington, I know we are working to settle Afghani refugees. So I guess maybe some clarification between that 5 and 10. And then did any testimony come up where you are starting to identify some districts that are emerging as needing more support in this regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason I sort of said 5 and then 10 was that there are 5. I'm looking at my other screen at their districts all in Chittenden County. There's Burlington, South Burlington, Winooski, Essex, and Champlain Valley, CVU, that all have over 100 students that require ELL services. Over 500 for Burlington, about 275 for Winooski, and then less for the other ones, but all of them over 100. So that's 5 districts over 100. Those are the 5 districts that get the federal aid. And then there's a 6th district, I think it's Colchester, that's got the next level, and they qualify for, I think, a $10,000 federal grant, like a mini baby grant from the feds that's saying you're almost reaching the threshold. I think it's because of an increase in numbers. And then there are districts, and I will point to Ms Manley, who's on the screen, I believe from Milton, if I'm remembering correctly, who is another district that's sort of getting increasing numbers. And I think those districts that are getting increasing numbers in quite a few students as new Americans and refugees move out from Winooski and Burlington into the suburbs or whatever, those districts are feeling the pressure of a large increase influx of students suddenly. And so those are the sort of 2nd tier districts that, maybe are going to need more resources. And then the 3rd tier districts are those that are in the more rural areas that have only a few students. But your point, Senator Campion, about new refugees coming in, I think Brattleboro is going to make that list of the 2nd tier districts if more refugees settle there. And that leads me to one thing I forgot to mention. Another recommendation of the task force was that we provide AOE with additional resources to support school districts in their English language learning. And I think you'll hear directly from them that they support that to the extent that they're able to say they support new positions. But as districts like Milton get more students, they need the support and the help to be able to build the programs that those top 5 districts already maybe have built. There's only one ELL person at AOE. It's not a sufficient amount given the growing needs of our school districts and our students in this area. So a second recommendation of ours was to provide more resources to AOE to support school districts.
If I may, and I apologize if you've already covered this, but as it relates to the federal dollars coming in, what's the connection there with the direction that we're moving in? Will we lose federal dollars, or these federal dollars will continue to come in and just continue to support this good work?
Yeah,
That's
the federal
okay.
dollars are based on the number of students in a district, and
Right.
they would remain.
Okay.
That's under Title III funding, I believe. It's not a lot of money. It's, I think, about $510,000.
Okay.
And that funding would continue.
Would continue. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Senator Perchlik.
I think we heard testimony from at least one school that said they qualify for the federal aid, but they don't do it because there's not enough money in relation to the paperwork involved.
Really? Okay.
It's another issue for the schools that only have, 5 or 6 or 7 students.
Yeah.
They might get the, $5,000, but they haven't done it because it's just not worth it.
Yeah, that's certainly potential. There is also a required test called the Toefl Test, and I cannot remember what that stands for, but the students are required to take that every year to demonstrate their level of English language competency. And that is used to determine sort of the level of services that they're required to have under federal law. And so that's another sort of measure that could be used. I mentioned that one of the outcome measures that was used, that the only outcome measure that was used by the report authors was standardized tests in math and English. But TOEFL scores could be another sort of evaluation tool. The task force was really keen on making sure that if we're going to make these major changes to our funding system, that we evaluate whether or not they were effective and whether they improved the learning outcomes of students in our state.
TOEFL stands for Tests of English as a Foreign Language.
Thank you. And I see that you have AOE testimony on your website, and somebody from AOE is coming in. We also had testimony that is very similar to what you're going to get. And so that's really important for hearing from them about what they're doing already.
Great. Senator Hardy, I think just the way we're going to have to structure this today is we might have to leave it there with you and just stick with, if you're okay with that, the ELL component, which actually helps, I think, our thinking. We could stay on this topic and just transition into our witnesses if you're okay with that.
Yeah, that's fine. And I'm happy to come back and help.
I appreciate that.
You need. So thank you so much. And
no, thank you very much.
Senators, please reach out if you have questions. Yeah,
we
thank
will,
you.
and we'll look forward to seeing you again. And thanks for spending this time with us. We know that you also have pressing issues and similar issues in finance. So thanks a million.
My pleasure. Take care, everyone. Good luck.
Thanks. Thank you. Ms. Manley, welcome to Senate Education. Thanks for being with us. You are muted, just and there you are. No, yep, we've all been there. Delighted to have you, and we'll start with you if that's okay. And
sure. I'm not sure I was first on the list, so I apologize to anyone else.
Right. So we don't see the first on the list.
Okay.
And you were the first to arrive. So
I was
that's
the first one here.
Actually, now we do see Ms. Bordenero. So we will shift.
Hi.
Bordenero, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Good. Thanks for joining us. Ms. Manley, if you don't mind, we will shift.
Oh, not at all.
All right, terrific. Thanks. So Ms. Bordenero, you're the division director for the Agency of Education related to federal and education support programs. Thanks for being with us.
Sure.
I don't know if you had an opportunity to hear Senator Hardy, but we are, as you know, focused on the ELL component to the weighting study. And we would welcome your comments, feedback. So the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate being asked to come in. I should say right off the bat that Jim McCobb, who has spoken to the weighting study on the EL issue, was for many, many years, I think 20-something years, the EL coordinator at the State Agency of Ed. He just retired last month. So we're filling his position, and so I'm kind of stepping in as his interim. His position sat within my division, So I'm familiar, but not as familiar as he was with the work of the waiting study regarding EL and also with the situation of ELs more generally in the state. So there may be occasional questions where I have to say, I'm not sure, I'll get back to you. But this presentation is mostly a programmatic perspective. So as far as the actual costs of educating an EL student, I noticed in the report, there's different, there's different methodologies for determining that, or whatever. I can't really speak to any of that, but I can give you kind of the lay of the land. 60% of Vermont LEAs have one or more students who are defined as EL. And being defined as EL means you haven't yet reached a level of proficiency in English to be assumed to be able to succeed in meeting the state's academic standards. So some kids are EL for say 3 years and then they're no longer EL. In fact, that's the goal. But at any given time, about 60% of Vermont LEAs have one or more kids who are defined as EL. That number is increasing. And in addition, the distribution of those students is increasing actually even faster. So EL families are spreading out across the state. More communities are accepting refugees, for example. And so both the student numbers and the distribution of those students is increasing in recent years. Our LEAs face two types of challenges. So we have some LEAs with large numbers of ELs consistently, mostly in Chittenden County, and they face the challenge of meeting the needs of students from multiple language backgrounds. They're often a refugee resettlement placement site, and as you know, those refugees come from a number of different parts of the world and different language backgrounds. So they're often, getting new students placed with them from brand new language backgrounds. Also, a lot of these students have pretty severe social, emotional, academic needs, like gaps in their education or trauma from the experiences that they've had. So there's a lot of needs associated with meeting the needs of these populations. We also have our LEAs with small numbers of ELs, and they are not necessarily small LEAs. It could be, some of our larger cities, but they don't have at this time a lot of English language learner students. And they struggle to come up with the funding to adequately support the required programming for their EL students. They also often lack the in-house expertise to understand and comply with federal education requirements because they simply don't have enough students to draw down some of the money that would enable them to have the staffing, sort of regular full-time staffing that some of the districts with larger EL populations have, like parent liaisons and district EL coordinators and, several EL teachers and, a dedicated staff. Equity is a challenge across the state, as the report pointed out. We have, whoever was doing the work on the report did a sample of LEAs and found that Vermont LEAs currently report spending somewhere from $3,000 to $10,000 per student. I would suspect if we were to gather data from every single LEA in Vermont that has at least one EL student, we find it's even wider than that. But obviously that's an equity challenge. In terms of educational obligations under federal law, there are three major laws that all school districts have to comply with, whether they have a single EL student or hundreds of them. There's the 1964 Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits recipients of federal financial assistance from discriminating on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And then there's the 74 Equal Educational Opportunities Act that requires school districts to take actions to overcome language barriers that impede the participation of their students in the entire instructional program. And then there's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which actually was passed in 1965 and has been reauthorized over and over again. And the most recent reauthorization, the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, has substantially increased the requirements for schools and school districts related to EL student instruction. There's additional assessment and reporting requirements, for example, and those requirements, many of them have been moved into what's called Title I of that act as well as Title III, which is specifically the EL portion. So all school districts and schools must meet the requirements of all three of these laws, as I said, regardless of how many EL students they have or how much funding they have to provide this. And as I said, those requirements have increased in recent years, as well as the student population is increasing. And last but not least, in terms of sort of federal background, school districts have to spend funds to enhance, not reduce, equitable access by ELs to the entire educational program offered to all the students. So when it comes to federal funding, which I'll discuss in a second, that's where you hear this supplement, not supplant requirements. So they can't take, say, regular literacy funding to provide their EL literacy program. They have to provide the literacy program to all students, including the EL students. And then in addition to that, provide whatever the students need in addition in terms of English language development to access the full program, including the literacy program. And that often means, in addition, extra supports for parents, translations of materials, and all the rest. In terms of federal EL grant funding, which my division oversees, the Title III of ESSA includes a formula grant program designed to support EL assessment, instruction, parent engagement, and other required federal activities. In Vermont, an LEA has to have at least 50 students to qualify for the minimum $10,000 grant. We have those grant awards are determined by formula. We have 6 districts in Chittenden County that consistently meet that 50 or more student minimum or threshold in order to qualify for grants. Barry used to, when there was a large influx of Bosnian immigrants a long time ago, but those students have aged out and grown in proficiency so that they're no longer considered ELs. And so Barry no longer qualifies. So basically, those are the only school districts in the state that qualify for this additional federal funding. That means 46 of the 52 LEAs don't qualify for this funding. And remember, up above, I mentioned that the majority of school districts have at least one student who is considered an English language learner. The total state allocation, which was mentioned in the report of $510,000 for Title III, is actually a little misleading because some of that is set aside for grant administration, and a big chunk of it is set aside for a contract with a consortium that provides our EL assessment and professional learning. We're required to do annual assessment of every single EL student, and that window is going on right now as we speak. And we are part of a consortium where a vendor provides the assessment and scores the student results and all that kind of stuff, as well as providing a whole lot of professional learning opportunities and modules for our teachers. So of what remains from that grant, we have about $308,000 that we grant out each year. And as I said, there were 6 LEAs that consistently get that, and their awards in 2021 range from $25,000 to $125,000. So not a lot of additional money per student on top of whatever they're spending in their local funds. And last but not least, in terms of our role at the agency, for many years, we've had one FTE devoted to EL work, which would include administration of the assessment, all required data collection and reporting, grants management, and then all the technical assistance and capacity building for schools, school districts, and sometimes even teachers. And in the LEAs with fewer EL students, they in particular rely disproportionately on us here at the agency to enable them to understand and meet their requirements, to provide guidance about best practices instructionally, to provide information about professional learning, to help them navigate the civil rights requirements under Title VI, for example. Since they don't have typically an EL coordinator or even a full-time EL teacher sometimes, many times, we become much more critical as a resource in those situations. But as I said, we just have the one person who does all of this work, and assessment administration, data collection, and reporting have become an increasing component of that person's work because of the shift in the federal rules and the ESSA reauthorization. There's just a lot more requirements now around assessment and data collection and reporting than there used to be. So in general, from a programmatic perspective, I would say that the agency supports the recommendations of the Pupil Weighting Task Force report regarding funding EL students through a categorical aid approach, and also regarding enhancing AOE staffing capacity to support LEAs in effectively and equitably educating our state's growing and increasingly diverse and geographically widespread EL population. So that is sort of the background, and I'm happy to answer questions as best I'm able.
Senator Perschlick.
And I apologize if I missed it in your last statement there, but is AOE supporting the task force recommendation for additional staff person at AOE?
Yes. Yeah, what we found is that it is difficult to provide the level of technical assistance and professional support, professional learning, and particularly technical assistance to LEAs, because we must meet the federal mandates for assessment, reporting, data collection, if you grants management, monitoring. If you don't do all those things, first and foremost, you lose the funding. So if something has to give, what has to give is our availability to respond to questions from the field, from superintendents, from curriculum directors, from teachers, from all the rest in terms of sort of on the ground needs, like how do I interpret this statute, or what is my obligation regarding translation of these materials, or can you tell me about some professional learning opportunities that would target this area for my staff, like content, supporting content teachers in modifying instruction for EL students, or all these different questions that come our way that we could otherwise devote more time to if we had more capacity.
And do you think that one additional staff person is adequate, or do you think it would be more than that?
It's 100% more than what we have now. So one would be wonderful, two would be even better. I can't say that I'm speaking for the task force or the agency here, because I don't know if the secretary, for example, or the task force had a particular number in mind. But I certainly would be more than over the moon to get any additional staffing. So one, as I said, would be 100% better than where we are now. And anything beyond that would be icing for me.
Thank you.
Senator Hooker.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Modano. Can you specify, how much time this one person who's in the department working with ELL students or programs spends on the LEAs beyond the 6 that are getting the federal funding? I mean, how much time is spent with the people who don't qualify for the federal funding?
I can't exactly say that. What I can say is we've done a rough breakout of how much time is spent on assessment and data collection and reporting compared to grants management and technical assistance and all the rest. And we estimate right now that the one person we have spends about 70% of their time throughout the year on assessment, data collection, and reporting. So that includes both the LEAs that have a lot of ELs and the LEAs that don't, because they are required under federal law, whether they have any federal funding or not, they must assess every single EL student every year using this access assessment. And they have to go through a lot of steps to become certified through the vendor to administer the test, and then, collect the materials necessary for the vendor to create the test materials and do test security and all, there's a lot of material. There's a lot of responsibilities around that. So that would be aid to both the districts with a lot of ELs and not. I would suspect we spend more time. This is a hunch that we would spend more time on that kind of mechanics of assessment, explaining to the LEAs with fewer ELs, because we have district EL coordinators in, for example, Burlington and Winooski, who've been doing this for a number of years and who know a lot of these procedures and rules, and so probably don't need quite as much hand holding as a curriculum coordinator in a district that just got its first 3 EL students, for example, who would never have had to administer access before, wouldn't know how, never had to collect certain data about their students before, is going to need a lot of hand holding in order to do that. Now, another chunk, probably if that takes up 70% right now, I'd say then maybe another 15 to 20% of the time is spent on grant administration. So everything from, getting out the application, reviewing the application, and the investments, making sure they're all allowable, working with the district to modify their application, doing amendments, doing monitoring, all of the part that goes into federal grants management. That is only going to be those 6 LEAs because they're the only ones that get the grants. So, if I just said 70, 85%, probably 85% of time is taken up with those activities. That leaves about 15% of the person's time to spend on any kind of technical assistance. And so the districts that have the fewest EL students are going to need the most technical assistance. So without being able to say exactly, I would say there's not a lot of time left.
Okay, thank you.
For that work.
Yeah.
I know it was a constant frustration of the EL coordinator who just left, retired, that he got a lot more questions and wanted to do a lot more work with districts and a lot more policy work than he was able to do. Like EL standards development, sort of reviewing the standards and are they appropriate for, right now, or do we need to update them? And then doing work with districts to understand the standards. Maybe they need to adapt or adopt them, things that we know we should do and need to do, but because it isn't part of those minimum things we must do, they just keep getting shunted to the side.
Okay, and can I just follow up?
Absolutely.
What about curriculum for ELL? I mean, what does the agency have as far as helping the districts to come up with curriculum, especially in those places where it's new? I mean, Burlington, Winooski, they've been doing it a long time. But what about the new?
We don't have a state EL curriculum. We rely on the districts to, and each one is going to be somewhat different. Like, well, they're not all going to be so different, but I mean, there's going to be different needs. For example, for regular ed teachers to support EL students within their classroom, that's one type of curriculum and set of skills versus an actual English language curriculum to teach reading, writing, speaking, listening skills. There are a number of curricula out there. And our vendor, we're part of, I mentioned before, the WIDA Consortium, Wisconsin, something, but about 37 states are part of that. And that's one of the major things we buy from WIDA because it's beyond our capacity as a state agency alone to do this, and also a lot of other states' capacities. We buy professional development, we buy standards, we buy support around curriculum. So while no one is required to use any particular state curriculum, for example, we help the teachers and the school district people to access these resources that we have sort of purchased on their behalf, really excellent resources. But the kind of level of involvement with curriculum that you might be talking about, we don't have at the agency. The other thing is we rely on the teachers to be EL certified and therefore to have been exposed to EL curriculum as part of their preparation. But in fact, the reality is that with the growing number of EL students that we have and their distribution around the state becoming more widespread, and now more recently with COVID and staff shortages in general, we're perpetually short EL teachers, fully licensed EL teachers, particularly for the more part-time jobs spread out in remote areas where you might have to work in 5 or 6 different school districts to come up with a full-time FTE. And so I think our most recent federal report, Jim's predicted we needed about 30 more licensed EL teachers than we currently have.
I'm sorry, how many?
I think he
30?
said, and I could check this, but I think he said 30, which is a substantial increase from where we are right now. And we're simply not producing them fast enough. We don't have enough, EL teachers being produced. So to rely on the teachers to know the curriculum piece is challenging because a lot of them are on provisional endorsement,
Sure.
Things like that.
Senator Hooker, do you have a follow-up before Senator Lyons?
Yeah. Do you know how many EL courses there are available in Vermont? I know St. Mike's has a good program. Others that have programs that can help to produce these ELL teachers. And it just, I mean, it strikes me that if a refugee family moves into a district, you know, you don't have time to come up to speed if you don't have an English language learning teacher in the district already. So how do you provide for that in the interim?
It's a huge challenge. So I'm not the person who can best speak to the breadth of EL endorsement programs that we currently have in the state. Patrick Halliday is the director of education quality, and that's the division that oversees teacher preparation programs. As far as I know, there is only one institution in the state still that prepares, you know, is approved to prepare EL teachers. I could be wrong about that though. I do think we have the alternate routes. We have peer review, and we have endorsement, transcript review, and we have a program that I don't know what they call it anymore, but it's like an alternative licensure program. So there are a couple of other ways, short of doing a full university, say graduate degree in EL, to become licensed. And we're working with several other organizations. I just had a very long conversation today with a federal group out of that has a grant from Department of Ed that is working in the Northeast region to try to improve the capacity of rural New England states to meet the needs of EL students, including they offer to different states the possibility of these like micro credentials, and it's particularly directed at educators who are content teachers, like elementary science, math, whatever, who also want to get a micro credential in EL to better support their kids' learning within their classroom, special educators and all.
Sure,
But
sure. We're gonna have to leave it there with that for now. We're just running out of time quickly, and I want to make sure Senator Lyons has her questions answered, and we have time for other witnesses. We will certainly have Mr. Holliday as well as the institutions of higher education in. Thank you. Senator Lyons, you're muted.
I knew you wanted to hear me. I can save my question.
No,
but
no.
it really relates to what Senator Hooker was saying around curriculum, but also guidelines and what requirements the state places on schools that indicate they have ELL students. So we heard that the money might go in, but it might not be spent exactly for ELL instruction or services for students. Before I am willing to drop weighting and move to categorical aid, or even if I move to categorical aid, I want to know that there are some requirements within the agency for how students are instructed and what's going on in the school. I'm very, 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 very positive about the schools in my district who are doing an exceptional job. But it would be great if we had some little package, as you were talking about, that could be opened up and used wherever we see a need for this kind of instruction. It's a question. You don't have to answer it now, but I do want to hear it sometime.
Sure. I was going to say, I think I need to do more research into this. Jim would have known this in more depth than I do. And I'm mostly familiar with the federal requirements more so than the state. And I don't know if we have any separate state requirements. That's what I would want to investigate related to, say, curriculum standards, proficiency, and all for English language learners. It's my understanding that most of the requirements are federal. So we have to set proficiency standards for entry and exit from the program, which we do. So all districts who have EL students are having to assess their students and go ahead.
Well, yeah, no, I get it. I understand that what you did say that, but there may be some things that we can do at the state that offer reassurance to people who don't think that these funds are being appropriately or adequately used. And so having some guidelines at the state level might be reassuring, and it might also help to move some of these programs from one place to another.
Mm-hmm.
So that a question, do we have something like that? or was that a recommendation of your predecessor?
I cannot say. What I'll do is reach out to him and ask. As far as I know, as I said, I don't know the state sort of standards, like within school quality standards, for example. I don't know if there's standards about educating ELs, because that's not the purview of my division. I'm also going to talk to Jess DeCarolis, whose Student Pathways division, is the one that mostly deals with curriculum. I don't know if they have anything in Student Pathways that would that I could direct you all to. So I can get back to you on that.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Bordenero. Appreciate you being with us, and we will have you back probably along with Mr. Holliday and our institutions of higher education to get us a sense of some of the training out there. I don't want to mispronounce your last name. Is it pronounced Ms. Ganguly?
Ganguly.
Ganguly. I wasn't even close. I apologize. Let me just write that down. Thanks for being with us. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, and as appreciate you coming early and hearing some of the testimony, and the topic we're on. Eager to hear your thoughts on the weighting report.
So good afternoon. My name is Kaya Ganguly, and I am the Director of Trauma Prevention and Resilience Development.
For the state.
For the state, yes.
The state, okay.
I was based out of, this position was based out of the Secretary's office in AHS, but was moved to the Department of Mental Health, just I think to get a better fit. And I started in June.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. So when we're talking about English as a second language and English second language learners, or ELLs, one of the things I think we really need to keep in mind, especially given the population that is coming into the state, is the effects of trauma and resilience, because these children and youth have undergone extreme trauma, especially the ones we're having come over from Afghanistan, which has a marked impact on the ability to learn and the support that is needed. They also have incredible resilience, because to make it here with their families and start a new life is challenging when you choose to be an immigrant and move versus being a refugee and having to leave. So they're also dealing with a host of issues, including grieving, loss of life, often a way of life, a loss of family members and community. And they're coming into a community where many of them do not speak the language. Many of them have not experienced this type of climate. Many of them are of a different religious group. They may be of a different race. And they're dealing with a good amount of resistance and assumptions when they come into the United States and into Vermont. So when you're dealing with extreme trauma such as this, one of the things that gets affected is your ability to actually learn. So your memory, your attention, your understanding of social norms are all going to be affected. So while we're providing instruction and let's say we're doing everything we're supposed to do, we also need to consider what are the social and emotional impact, and how does that affect learning? And what support do they need for mental health, for social emotional growth, and for really creating a new life. In addition, we're looking at people and staff who are serving them who have been heavily affected by the trauma related to COVID. I mean, everything that's happened in these past 2 years, when you look around, I don't think I would have ever in my wildest dreams pictured so many things could happen at one time that have happened. And so the effects on individuals on the system as a whole and on communities is also at a higher level. So I think what we really need to do is make sure we're focusing on the resilience and the strengths that these families are bringing in. Because if you work from a place of strength, it will help mitigate the effects of trauma. But in order to do that, we need education and training for teachers, for aides, for support staff. So there are associated costs that may not come under direct, obvious ELL funding that will happen and that will need to happen.
Would you remind me, is it with AOE or are you with Department of Health?
I'm with the Department of Mental Health.
Department of Mental Health, okay.
Yeah, my background, if it helps, is I am all but my dissertation in school psychology. And
No, it's the reason I'm just curious is, one of the things we've learned, or we've been talking about in this committee for a while, but it was reintroduced last week, is how trauma, dealing with these kinds of issues, making certain that trauma is addressed. If we don't, there isn't going to be learning for any students.
Mhm.
It's such trauma, mental health issues, et cetera. And we know, as you just pointed out very eloquently, that indeed that things have, how many terrible things could be happening at once. And so to then pile that onto coming to a new country, having escaped a situation that's causing trauma, and to be in a different climate, different people, all of that is very hard. And I guess the question I'm trying to get at is, where does that additional funding go? Is it AOE, your department, combination of both? And I see Senator Lyons' hand up because she's also, as the chair of Health and Welfare. Senator Lyons, do you want to jump in here and say something about that?
No, I think, go ahead and finish your thought. I'll chime in.
Sure.
Yep.
So that I guess that's one of the things our committee will be looking at. Yes, there is this categorical grant. There is also the possibility of weights, but your very good point is there has to be other funding. And Ms. Portonero said it also, around teacher training, mental health supports, things like that. And I think what we'll have to just pull apart and give some direction to our committee on appropriations, where does some of this funding go? So. Senator Lyons, please.
Yeah, so thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to meet you. And I know that we owe you a visit in our committee, and we look forward to it. We started your position, I think, 2 or 3 sessions ago, and it is extremely important. So I'm thrilled that you're here. You raise all the issues that I am very concerned about when we start to move to limited aid. And I see, if categorical aid is not going to be limited, then it's great. But you've really identified the extent to which we need to think about we call them ELL students, but they are students from a foreign land, a foreign culture, a foreign language, and a home environment that's significantly different from what they meet when they go to school. So everything you have said, it really resonates so well. The question is, how do we assess the needs for these kids individually or as a group? So there may be similarities with the Afghanis who are moving in. Certainly there were similarities with the Ghanaian students in Winooski. But so how do we do that assessment, and how do we then translate that into needed resources? So I asked a question earlier about needs assessment, and I know, and it gets difficult, but perhaps that's something unique to what the state can do as compared with what the federal government is doing. And I don't know if you've given any thoughts to how to evaluate what's needed in terms of services. I suspect that the folks who are boots on the ground in our schools, such as in Milton or Burlington or Winooski, may have something to add as well.
Yeah, I would say the education system I know has been grappling with this, and I've talked to a lot of people because they talk to me because it's trauma and resilience related. I also know that USCRI and some of the has a mental health work group for refugees that gather together lots of different community members to talk about whatever issues are coming down the pike. Do I have an answer to how to do it? Not necessarily, but I would say, given what has happened to us in the past 2 years, these are services that I think most of the children in the schools need right now. We're dealing with an entire generation of children who've lost 2 years, in essence, and specifically with social emotional learning. So you have current 9th graders who are probably acting more like a 7th grader because they haven't had 2 years of social emotional interaction. So that increases behaviors, it increases some of that stuff. So you're going to see these, whether you're looking at English language learners or regular students. Mental health support's important. Peer support is very important. Mentorship is very important. Those are all pieces, and some of those pieces exist within the state in different ways. So I think on a professional level, I would say this is something that we need to create a web across schools, across communities, and different agencies to be able to create the type of support that the students will need.
So in terms of, so as a basic support going to schools, but then it sounds like you're suggesting that there be additional programs, at least in terms of reducing trauma for kids. And this could go on for a long period of time, but in the interim, at least, we need to stand up some significant support. And then we're speaking specifically about ELL, but so the kids coming from Afghanistan right now might be the ones that have the greatest need in that area.
Right. And what we're seeing too is, you're going to be seeing children who are coming here who've been dealing with war. And
Yes.
all the sites and
How to solve problems.
Well, and that's the part of the world I come from. So I'm very familiar with what's been going on and what happens because I hear it from my family all the time.
Wow.
I grew up bilingual and speaking both languages. I grew up receiving speech services. So I have a personal understanding of, well, I'm not a refugee and I'm an immigrant, and there is a difference because we chose to come here. I do, on a personal level, understand what it feels like to be an alien and to be very, very different from those around you. And I think it's going to be very challenging. I think it's doable. I have chosen to live in Vermont. I love Vermont. I've raised my children in Vermont. And seeing what our communities can do and have a real deep belief, but I've also seen, being a person of color, some of the things our communities can do. So, but I think for these children and youth, we really need to make sure that we're looking at all aspects and not just the language learning, because there's going to be that culture piece and everything.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Senator Lyons, for raising it. It's an important point.
I think that Kaya Ganguly raised it as well. So
yeah. Thank you both. Senator Perschlick.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks, Ms. Ganguly. You also testified, I remember, in front of the task force. In the task force report, I'll just remind the committee, in the back, we do have a recommendation that the legislature, in looking at the task force recommendations, specifically look at this. I think there's something like 30 states or something, 37 states that do have some kind of grant program to support mental health of students. And as Ms. Ganguly had expressed to the task force and expressing us here today, this is essential. And I agree that some kind of grant or program, because maybe not just for the students, there needs to be trauma-informed education of the teachers and everything like that. And this was identified even before, when Dr. Colby and the folks from Rutgers were doing their original weighting study implementation report. They interviewed teachers throughout the state, and this came up then, saying, oh my God, this trauma situation is important. We need to do something. I think at the time in the Dr. Colby report, is they are saying, you know, the state, they didn't recommend a weight because they wasn't sure how that was going to work, but they recommended, if you looked at the task force, I think took, you know, testimony from Ms. Ganguly and I don't know if others, and it had the kind of the same result, like, yes, it's important, but also didn't come up with a specific recommendation. So it would be great if there was a specific recommendation from either AOE or the Department of Health on this issue, because I think people are struggling with, everybody agrees that something needs to be done, but we haven't come up, I haven't heard a good suggestion yet. And unfortunately, I don't have a good suggestion either. So I'm also guilty of the same thing, but I'm hopeful that we can hear some recommendations on.
And that's something I can definitely get back to this committee on. I'd like to consult with my commissioner and some of the people who have been here a little longer to know sort of where we, you know, you're all familiar when you start a new job. It takes you a year or so to really get your feet under you in way of resources. I mean, so I would absolutely, I can get back to you with an answer on that based on where I see resources, because there are certain things I know about, but I'm not sure how the pieces fit together.
That'd be great. Thank you. Okay. I don't see any other additional questions, so we will leave it there. Thank you. We'll look forward to having you back in. Ms. Manley, excuse me, you are muted. And the floor, we will now give you the floor. I know we are losing, I think, no, we're good right now. Okay.
Okay.
Floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I've been on Zoom all the day. You think I'd learn about the muting. I did prepare a written statement just to keep me on track, and I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards as well. I did speak to the weighting committee, and this is very similar to that. And I want to say first, my name is Ms Manley. I am the Director of Teaching and Learning for the Milton Town School District, and otherwise known as Curriculum Director, but we have various names that we go by. I'm also by default, I am the English Language Learner Coordinator, Program Coordinator for the Milton Town School District as well. So I am testifying today to give insight to the task force on the resources needed to provide evidence-based high-quality instruction for students for whom English is not their home language. I want to recognize first that before we can learn, of course, trauma, the effects of trauma need to be mitigated before any students can learn. So I completely understand that and agree with it. I am more focused on what comes at the same time or next, and that is the instructional piece of that. So these students are English learners because their first or home language is not English, as you know. But given that the majority of the educational program is primarily offered in English, attaining English proficiency while fulfilling other educational expectations is key to their educational success in Vermont and the rest of the United States of America, of course. So even the social emotional learning that we would like to engage with these students on is most likely going to be conducted in English. So before we can get to that, we also have to consider their English language learning needs. So our school district is not in a position, we are a secondary migration school. So we are not one of the 5 schools or 6 schools that receives a grant. We have around 50 English language students that goes up and down on a weekly basis, depending on who moves out in and who moves out. Ideally, we would be maintaining first languages, because that is an ideal program, maintains both the first language and builds the new language for the students. But we are investing in efforts to provide the best English language programming that we can. We continue to do this, but not everything is within our power. I find that, and I'm going a little off script here, but I find that the weighting as it is now for us does not ensure in our community that the community values an English language program as much as the weighting does. So while the money comes in, that does not mean that the community will make the decision to spend that money on English language learning and those students. So depending on the school board and what they find important at that time, your superintendent and what they find important at that time, and what other advocates there are in your district, that will determine where the money goes. And so I've been lucky enough to work in a district that has a very strong belief in equity for all students in our district and believes very strongly in English language learning. And we have been able to maintain through leadership a very strong program, but it has taken significant, which is fine, but it's taken significant education of people to help them understand the need. And because they don't see it, it's hard for them to sometimes understand what that need might be. So I just want to say that I grew up in Danville, Vermont. I went to Danville schools, K through 12. I went to UVM. I went to St. Mike's for my certificate advanced graduate studies, Johnson State College. And I think that the new vibrancy that Vermont is gaining through influx of students that are learning different languages is incredible. And I think we all know that knowing English well is a key to success in our country and in our state. It will be in our state as well. So what is happening with us, as I alluded to, is Winooski is more primary migration. Those students in Burlington and Winooski are the primary migrants. For the most part, we are receiving what is more of a secondary migration. So these are families that have been in the area, but they may have gained a foothold and are now moving to the bedroom communities. So Milton is relatively affordable in terms of housing. And when I started in my position in 2015, we had 6 designated English learners, and today there are around 50. So you can tell that the growth is quite exponential year after year. When I started, we had a point, I'm just trying to remind myself, I think it was a 0.5 ELL teacher. And I can say that for most districts, keeping a 0.5 or a 0.2 or a 0.3 position is very, very difficult. So I think you heard someone else allude to stringing multiple 0.2 positions together to make a position. And so we have grown our program over time with significant stewardship to have 2 full-time EL teachers, which is a significant financial undertaking. That's about $200,000 if you're looking at the full package of compensation for a teacher that has a master's degree and could teach. You have to remember, these are not brand new teachers. These are usually teachers with multiple years of experience and that need an extra set of education to meet the needs. We anticipate that this is going to grow. So our population has outgrown the waiting for sure, and is not yet at the place where we would be receiving any aid from the federal government. So we're kind of we're tweeners right now, and our program is being held together by sheer will of the voter. And that's a little bit of they've been very good to us in our requests, and our board has been wonderful. But, that could change with one town meeting day election. And so it depends on the will of the voter, which I fully believe in. But it does determine where that money goes, because that money is not set aside for those students at this time. It is merely part of a big package. So I did want to say that it's important to have the expertise of a consistent full-time certified teacher in teaching English as a second language. And we've worked towards that goal, and we've been able to attain it, but many, many districts that are in similar shoes to ours have not been able to do that, because those part-time teachers, part-time positions don't come with benefits. As you know, with the great resignation, that may become even more true. And we are worried that we will not be able to find enough folks to staff the positions unless we can make them full-time positions that have significant, longevity for teachers, and that they know are going to be there. If it's a year-by-year situation with the influx and the outflux of students, which is what happens to a lot of these towns, is one family can have 5 or 6 children, and then they move away, you're looking at major swings in budget changes. So we know that one family of primary migration moving to Milton could make a huge shift in our program necessary. And so we're lucky that our budget, which is around 35 million, I believe it will be this year, something around there, is able to, I don't want to say flex, because that makes it sound like we have money sitting around, which we do not, but it allows us to make choices in order to serve students if they must be served when they come into our districts. But I would imagine that schools smaller than ours with smaller budgets, every dollar is accounted for every day in every school. And so it must be more difficult with a lower budget to find that money that might be left over by attrition or something else to help serve those students. So my thoughts are that pupil weighting seems to be with an initial block of funds to ensure the basis for a solid program for any school that does have one or more students, and then pupil weighting, the per pupil amount after that seems to be a better way to do it than pupil weighting itself, which is not set aside for students that are EL students. And also looking forward, requiring, and this is where the state higher education comes in, requiring all of our teachers to have a basic teaching English as a second language class as part of their teacher preparation program. That would ensure that we have the flexibility and the background knowledge for all of our schools. You'll notice that in other states, such as Massachusetts, all teachers, all administrators are required to take a course in teaching English as a second language and to understand the complexities of that. And that is not true in Vermont. So looking forward, that would be a way to mitigate some of the gap in knowledge that may happen in outlying schools as they begin to receive more and more students that are from varying backgrounds.
So Ms. Manley, may I interrupt? So for example, if you're
absolutely,
if you're a 5th grade teacher, or I don't know, a 7th grade science teacher, in Massachusetts, there's also in their teacher training programs, you're saying there's also a course that students need to take in order to be certified.
Yes. It's a basic, my superintendent is from Massachusetts originally, and she took it, but it's a basic course. And it's about, what's good for English language students is also good for all students when they're learning language. Yeah. So it's really about accessing, enabling all students to stay in class, to get basic language acquisition skills. And it really helps teachers understand that they, in many cases, may already have those skills. Sometimes teaching an English student of a different language that has a different language may be daunting unless you know that you probably already have some of these skills, or you could easily get them through your toolkit, in your toolkit by taking a simple course.
Questions for Ms. Manley?
I just want to say thank you for being here. It's great to see you and your ideas. I just want to clarify one thing that you said. You
Sure.
said that the weighting factor is fine as long as there's some additional upfront funding.
So I think I may have
Grant?
misspoken. Yeah. So the pupil weighting, where they weight them as poverty, what happens is those funds get intermingled with all of the other
Oh,
funds.
right. Got it. Okay.
So instead, at one point, there was an idea around providing like 25,000 for the first student and then 5,000 for every student after that. And it's a little bit of a set aside for English language students. And I
Right.
think that has a little bit of a protective factor in terms of it's not bringing down, being used for buildings and maintenance, for instance.
Right.
It's set aside for education of students that are sometimes our most vulnerable.
Okay, but then you also said, it sounded to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you supported weighting factors for ELL students.
For our purposes at our school, the weighting does not really do that much
Yeah, okay.
for us.
Right, okay, yeah.
So really, and I understand that different schools have different needs, and I know you're trying to balance the needs of different schools. We're also in Chittenden County, as I said, and it happens that we're one of those schools where the weighting does not benefit us.
Right.
Is because, it just doesn't. And so we are probably, we are not in a terrible position because we're still in Chittenden County. We still have a tax base. We still have some economy of scale in our system. I guess my concern is more for schools that do not have that economy of scale in the English language programming or their English language capacity, that it's very difficult to reach that economy of scale fund-wise with weighting. You almost need to start with something and then have weighting, or start with something, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, very much so. It does make sense. It's hard to calculate. It's hard to put it into fundraising and budgeting terms, but it makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thanks.
Senator Persley.
You, Ms. Manley, did you say you had 50 ELL students or somewhere around there?
Right around there, yes.
Okay, so even with that number, you're not receiving any of the federal Title III funds?
No.
Okay.
And we also, there is a struggle between fully immersing our students into classrooms, regular classrooms. We want access for all of our students into peer level classrooms. And so we could save money by putting all of our EL students in one first grade classroom, for instance. I'm sure you can understand that that's quite problematic. We have 6 first grade classrooms. And so while we do try to keep peer clusters together, like affinity clusters together, we are forced to cluster somewhat, but we try to spread the students through as many classrooms as possible to create equitable classrooms. So that's another funding. It's more costly to be equitable in that scenario than it would be to just say, okay, well, one teacher can have these 50 kids, they can have them so many blocks a day. That's easy. Doing it in an equitable manner that allows access for all is more costly, but it's more beneficial in the end.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I want to echo what you said about the weights in the grants, in that it is very different from the different schools. Like even with 50, it might seem like a small part of the community. I think in some communities, the English language speakers are very prevalent, and the community is part of that and wants to see that. I think it is difficult for those communities when it's 5 ELL students and it comes to developing the budget and how much money are they going to spend, even if they have the weight and are able to spend that money based on the weights. It could be a very challenging discussion in some communities, and by doing a grant or a grant and a weight, that really takes that away, and just like automatically the money will be going to that school, and they will need to spend it on that ELL teacher. So at least they could have a half-time teacher. Understanding it might be difficult to find one and piece it together with other schools, but I think it is something important for the committee to think about how different communities are impacted differently. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Manley, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sorry, Senator Hooker, did you want a final question?
Just a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
I'm looking at the numbers that you gave us about the money that's being spent on the ELL teachers and testing. Do you have an approximation of how much you spend per student from your budget?
Per student in general?
On your ELL students?
Oh, and our ELs, I don't, I'm sorry. I could get that number to you. But if I took my numbers and divided them by 50,
I could $100.
Yeah.
When you had all these other costs that you had,
Yeah,
and I'm just curious, as a school that seems dedicated to educating the ELL students, then I'd like to know, approximately how much you're spending.
I would say, like, I just did the quick math on round math, and I got $4,000.
Okay.
About $4,000 per student. That's with testing supplies for the teachers, and the teachers' salaries and benefits. I would say it's just under that, probably.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Manley. I know you'll follow the conversation. We're going to pick this up again next week, and appreciate the time and effort you've already put into not only this committee, but to your work with the committee over the summer. So thank you.
Yes, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
We appreciate that you were willing to be with us. Committee, let's take 10 minutes. We've been at it for 2 hours, and then we'll come back and pick up with Ledge Council, continuing a bit on the work that we started yesterday around or on Church and State. Thanks.